Wargaming tactics, castle deployment. That's what we're going to explore in this vlog. Working my way through some mailbag here under the Wargaming tactics playlist. Under this playlist on my channel, I've been pushing up wargaming tactics, wargaming ideas that are universal. They sit on top, they layer over any wargaming system that you are playing. So if we can utilize these ideas, not only can you plug and play, but you can look at the armies and the rules and the systems that you're playing and see how they work and utilize to your advantage. And in exploring ways to deploy, there's a couple of questions on castle deployment or corner deployment. So this is the power of this type of deployment. And this is the idea of this type of army or list that tends to favor it. Imagine your wargaming table. Most war games, most units, you're physically bound by the edges of the table. You can't voluntarily leave the table edge. If you do, if you're forced off the table edge, you fail some sort of morale check, or you're pinned and you break, like in Chain of Command, the unit moves off the table, they're gone. You might get some mission points, you might get this, but they're gone. There are some rules where a unit can fly off the table like in Battletech and then fly on the opposite side a turn later because it represents that it's moving fast and making like a strafing attack. But for units that cannot willingly leave the table, what this means is you are limited by the physical dimensions. Deployment is the second piece, meaning, again, in most wargaming systems, the units can only enter from a certain point on the table, whether it's a jump-off point like in Chain of Command, which is markers placed down on the table. When a unit enters the game, it deploys from that marker point, or at the beginning of the mission, right, your table edge where you're placing your units. Some games have ways to enter as the game is progressing through different table edges, but again, the table edge for the most part is this like invisible wall, this invisible line. Well, castle deployment makes use of that. Castle deployment is where you take the bulk of your army and you deploy it literally on the left or right side corner of your table. What this means is the table edge facing you where you're sitting, you're protected there. Your opponent can't attack from there. If you're on the right side protects you. Essentially, they can only come from the left, this funnel. The idea with castling is literally you are setting up in the corner to limit how your opponent can approach. By limiting how they can approach, now you can really focus your fire. Castle deployment usually favors armies that are shooting, that are very shooting, very, very powerful from that perspective, where you are just going to blast away on the table and your opponent can only approach from a certain area, from a certain perspective. You're limiting it with how to utilize it. Now, there are some ways, of course, to break the castle deployment, meaning if your opponent can move very, very fast, well, you're in this one area, so they'll close with the bulk of their army. Or if they have weapons that can attack with artillery or deal with area effects while your entire army is in one area, looking at how that works and understanding if you're going to castle up, you need those limitations to be aware of them. So let me pull in an example. Warhammer 40,000, my Grey Knight list. Grey Knights are Space Marine chapter. They fight against heretics and demons and chaos and stuff. Many ways to build the various factions and army in 40K. This army list not only plays some of my favorite units, but is built to exclusively use this castle type doctrine. It can use other ones, but I built it with this in mind. So let's illustrate with that. And if you're not familiar with Warhammer 40,000, I'm going to be talking about some of the units that I deploy and the thoughts behind them. Again, just to illustrate. We're not talking about a specific system, but we're using a specific system to show this tactica so you can take it, pull it out, and put it into your game. So my list starts with 3 Land Raiders. Land Raiders in Warhammer 40,000 are these heavily armored, massive battle tanks. They have las cannons, which are powerful laser cannons that not only deal a lot of damage, but have tremendous range. The Land Raider can also hold infantry inside of it, so it protects them. I have these 3 land raiders in the corner. They're heavily armored tanks. They have long range with multiple las cannons. They sit there and blast multiple las cannons every single turn. My infantry inside are protected from artillery and bombardment and other things because they're physically in the tanks. And the tanks are very, very heavily armored. So if you stay back and try to shoot me at range, I'm going to try and use terrain. I'm going to get hull down, the heavy armor of the land raiders, and the las cannons blasting you. I also have dreadnoughts, which are kind of these robots when a Grey Knight warrior is wounded and can't return to the battlefield. They are entombed in a dreadnought. So it's kind of like a cybernetically controlled tank walker. These have las cannons. These have long range. So they're sitting back adding firepower. If you close to engage, right, get up there with some close range, high-powered anti-tank weapons and some other things, at that point, I can release my infantry and flood my infantry out. So it's this castle where I'm here, I'm shooting. You can only approach in one way. You're funneled in very, very close. And once you close, the assault ramps drop from the land raiders, and I just flood out with infantry to take you in close combat, storm bolters, close combat weapons, and other things, leveraging the power of the Grey Knights in the assault to try and take you out. A very, very tight, quick example of a castle-type army. Now, there are other elements that go into that list and the tactica of using them, but essentially what you do is taking really long-range, powerful shooting stuff, putting it in the corner, protecting it, and saying to your opponent, look, come in and fight me. There's only one way in, and I'm going to blast you on the way in. I'm going to castle you. I'm going to funnel you into that way in. So looking at your own armies and your own lists, how do you see utilizing this castle deployment model, this castle deployment paradigm?